Had France decided to go communist in the 1930s, undoubtedly they would ally with the Soviet Union and abandon the United Kingdom. This alternate France, I bet, would be less tolerable to Germany violating the Treaty of Versailles, so they're not going to do the whole appeasement strategy. With the Comintern perhaps expanding into Spain, I can potentially see Britain and Poland to surprisingly ally with ultranationalist Germany in Italy, so the Second World War could start with these front lines in 1939. Let me cover how France could go communist in the 1930s, how their potential decolonization game would go, and then this alternate Second World War, so let me show you what I came up with. First up, how do we make France go communist? Well, surprisingly, it wouldn't be as difficult as one may think, as historically France was dangerously close to a left-wing government being formed, and even after the Second World War they were almost there, with the left-leaning parties getting about 45% of the votes. For the purpose of this video, I want to make the Communist Party of France come to power, with their best performance in parliament being 15.26% in the 1936 French legislative election. Historically there, they joined the Popular Front with the French section of the Workers' International, Radical Socialist Party and other smaller socialist parties, all led by Léon Blum. I bring this up because France was already firmly socialist from 1936 until they capitulated in 1940, so if I were to be very realistic, then the Communist Party of France would be more powerful, but still they have to form a coalition with other parties, and thus France would behave in a very similar way as historically. Further, realistically speaking, getting a party from 15.26% to a narrow majority would be very difficult. However, the German ultranationalist party led by the Austrian painter went from 2.63% in the 1928 German federal election to 43.91% by March 1933. So in the span of 5 years, they went from a very small party that eventually would establish a dictatorship. The nature of this video will be unrealistic, so keep it in mind. First up, I want to give you some context regarding the French Communist Party, as it would be very important regarding how they would later on come to power and what their rule would actually look like in terms of internal and foreign policies. It all started with the French section of the Workers' International, which I would simply be calling the SFIO, where they had been divided over support for the French participation in the Great War and whether or not to join the Communist International, also known as the Comintern. After the Great War, this issue of joining the Comintern or not fractured the party. In the spring of 1920, Ludovic Oskar Froissart and Marcel Kashin met with the Bolshevik leaders in Moscow. Vladimir Lenin sent out the 21 conditions for membership that any Communist Party needs to meet as to become part of the Comintern. When these French communists returned back home, Froissart and Kashin recommended that the party join the Communist International. At the SFIO's Tours Congress in December 1920, exactly this was discussed, and the option for the French section of the Workers' International to join the Comintern was supported by the left-wing faction, which was Boris Souvarne, Fernand Wariot, but also the centrist faction, Ludovic Oskar Froissart and Marcel Kashin. However, it was opposed by the right-wing faction, which was Léon Blum. The majority opinion in the party was to join the Comintern, which views were shared by 3/4 of the votes from the party members at this congress. The pro-joining the Comintern majority separated themselves from the SFIO and founded a new party, known as the French section of the Communist International, later renaming themselves to the Communist Party of France, according to Lenin's 21 points of entry. The new Communist Party of France defined itself as revolutionary, democratic centrist, and its skepticism over the parliament. Democratic centrism is an idea adopted by Lenin, in which discussion would be made in process of open debate amongst the party membership, and whatever the result of this arguing would be, must be followed through with all party members, even if they disagreed. Ludovic Oskar Froissart was the first Secretary General of the party, while Ho Chi Minh was also among the founders. Now here is the first change I would like to make, so the Communist Party of France would be stronger. The fact was that they were the majority in the SFIO, which as you would later on see would become their greatest competitors. So what if instead the pro-Comintern candidates leaving and making a new more unpopular party, they reformed the French section of the Workers' International, and those who disagree with them joining the Comintern would be the ones that would make a new separate party. Despite having 3/4 majority, the pro-Comintern membership of the party had to make their own, and this was because the SFIO was registered French political party under French law, which is a big deal. The party apparatus and ownership of certain assets were all tied to its existing legal charter, so when the Communist Party of France separated itself, they had to start from scratch. However, if they tried to reform the SFIO according to Lenin's principles, begin to purge people who disagreed, they could reform the SFIO to their liking, and this would be a big deal. Historically, the French Communist Party was very disorganized. Many of the experienced politicians stayed with the SFIO. The new leadership of the party was very fractured, had no experience, and was depending on Stalin to give them direct orders. Exactly this Comintern interference alienated potential French supporters, and the propaganda of the Soviet image further turned off many of the French left. So what we have made here is that the SFIO would reform into the French Communist Party we had historically, while people purged from the party would be the ones to form a new political party, and thus they would be the ones that would lose many of the party apparatus and certain assets. In all reality, we have made the Communist Party of France much stronger than historically right from the get-go when they would be formed, who in this alternate history would have a much better governance and better organization. Now I want to mention the 21 points of Lenin for parties to join the Comintern, and this is why the video is unrealistic. On the screen you would see point 13 and point 21, where especially the 13th point is very important, stating that all parties that seek membership in the Comintern must re-register, hence why the French Communist Party did it historically, rather than reforming the SFIO. So the most plausible way to achieve the narrative of this video is for Lenin not to write the 13th point, or perhaps for it to be a suggestion, which would really help out this scenario a lot. As such, in this alternate history, it would be the French Communist Party that would get the majority of the votes, rather than the new SFIO in the 1924 French legislative election. So I think that they would become the third largest political party, with about 15% of the votes. At the same time, the Communist Party of France campaigned against French colonialism in Morocco, which was the Rif War. As the communists would now have a larger share of the government, they can complicate this war much more for the French, who had decided to join this war basically to bail Spain out, which was losing their Moroccan holdings, and France feared that they would lose the entirety of Morocco if they didn't help. As the French communists would be in power and want to decolonize, they would oppose this war, so I can see French involvement there to be minimized. And thus the communists would claim that they have stopped the war, saved countless of lives and money, and thus I think that they would start to become a lot more popular. Spain, on the other hand, would have to deal with these rebels alone, which would be a lot more costly for them, but I think that they would eventually manage to secure a victory. From now on, I would be following what happened historically with the Communist Party of France, and tell you how they would deal with these challenges in this alternate history. Historically, in the French Parliament, the Communist Party of France was opposed to the Cartel des Gauches, which was the cartel of the left, a coalition historically formed by the SFIO and the Radical Party, which governed France between 1924 and 1926. Here in this alternate history, as the new SFIO is much weaker due to them losing 3/4 of their membership just 4 years prior, it would instead be the French Communist Party in a coalition with the Radical Party, plus other smaller left-leaning parties. So by 1924 the French Communist Party would begin to take part of the French government, which down the line would greatly snowball to them taking over. This time it would be the new SFIO that would be in opposition, but there is not a lot for them to do. Historically, as the communists were the ones in opposition, in order to reconcile with the various factions of the party, Pierre Semart was chosen as the new Secretary General. Most notably, he proposed an alliance with other left-leaning parties, including the SFIO, in order to combat ultranationalism, which was growing in France. This strategy was criticized by the hardcore communists, seeing it as parliamentarist. As a result of that, this further fractured the Communist Party of France, but the thing is that this never happens in this alternate history, as the communists are unlikely to seek reconciliation with the SFIO, so there would be more ideological purity in the party, thus making them stronger and more popular. In 1927, historically, Joseph Stalin sidelined his opponents, which were Zinoviev, Kamenev and Leon Trotsky. This resulted in the Communist Party of France to copy Stalin, where they denounced social democracy and stated the SFIO was akin to a bourgeoisie party. At the same time, Boris Souvarne was expelled from the Communist International and the Communist Party of France due to his sympathy for Leon Trotsky. Basically, historically, there was a lot of switching alliances for the Communist Party of France. First up, they were part of the SFIO, then they separated and were very hostile. Pierre Semart tried to fix relations and unite the two, but Stalin later gave out orders for this not to happen. Basically, in our history, the Communist Party of France truly had an identity crisis and were simply following Moscow's orders. In 1937, Maurice Thorez spearheaded the formation of an alliance with the SFIO, and later formed the Popular Bloc in 1936, where it was Moscow that told the French communists to join the Popular Front. I think that in a realistic scenario this would be the first major roadblock, as why achieving the narrative of the video would be unrealistic. The communists in France were just switching alliances left and right, being allied and hostile to the SFIO 3 separate times. Another example is that Jacques Giraud advocated for an alliance between the communists and the SFIO. Giraud was then expelled in 1934 with his followers. On an interesting side note, afterwards he moved sharply to the right and formed the French Popular Party, which would be one of the most collaborationist parties during the Vichy regime. The way to fix all of this leftist infighting in this alternate history so the narrative of the video can be achieved I think could be simple. As the Communist Party of France is by far the largest left-leaning party in this alternate history, so smaller parties may seek to join them. There, via the democratic centrism strategy, the larger Communist Party would impose their will onto the socialists, who would have to comply, and thus the Communist Party of France would grow by a lot as it would merge with other parties, or acquire new members, but ideologically it would remain similar. They will just sideline many ideas that weren't convenient to the Soviet Union and their 21 points of joining the Comintern. In the 1928 French legislative election, the Communist Party of France would become the largest party there, as basically them and the new SFIO would merge, where they can continue their coalition with the radicals and the communists can secure the prime minister position here. Likely Maurice Toureste, who was the party leader from 1930 to 1963, would become the new French prime minister. Historically, he imposed a Stalinist regime of the party governance from the late 1920s, which led to loss of membership through splits and expulsions, basically purges. This would be very suboptimal, but due to timing, all of it would happen when the French communists would already be leading the government, so it will not be a big deal. The next year, the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression would hit France especially hard, intensifying in the beginning in 1931. At this point, due to leftist infighting, I think that the government would collapse, and instead it would be led by the Democratic Alliance, Independent Radicals, Democratic and Republican Union, but also I can see the Radical Socialist Party to switch sides and abandon the French Communists, who despite being the most voted party would lose their grip on power, and this is a big deal. This Great Depression began an economic decline characterized by high unemployment, failing production and almost total collapse of international trade, and a profound loss of confidence in the capitalist system itself and the ability of governments to cope with the crisis. The source for this would be in the description. I think it makes sense for communism to be deposed just before the Great Depression, due to their infighting and Maurice Torres basically taking a Stalinist role and purging the party of non-purist believers, so the problems of the Great Depression will be passed on to the opposition. And these parties historically ruled France when this happened, so we know how they would react, which makes my life easier for this alternate history. The Europeans basically continue to do economic liberalism, which is considered as having failed due to lowering of wages and reduced spending, causing deflation, while today it is generally agreed that the best way to deal with an economic crisis is to print money and incentivize growth. As economic liberalism had failed in Europe and would in France this time around, the communists would get even more powerful due to them vigorously opposing it. The Scandinavian governments had seen some success in solving the economic problems by applying socialist economic measures. Also historically, the Soviet Union was barely impacted by the Great Depression due to their communist system and how they were not trading as much with the Western world, so it seemed that in 1931 the communist or socialist countries were the ones that would deal the best with the devastating Great Depression. The French communists are also going to point this out while they would be in opposition, but nobody in the government would listen. However, the general public would start supporting them way more than historically. As the economic crisis in the USA would deepen, the US Congress would adopt drastic measures, introducing protective tariffs in an attempt to prevent further economic devastation. The 1930 Holy Smooth Tariff Act imposed the highest import duties in US history, an average of 59%, despite objection from over 30 countries. This effectively closed off American markets to foreign products. However, this move proved to be counterproductive, as many countries retaliated by imposing their own protective tariffs, closing their markets to US imports. By 1931, tariff rates in Europe had increased by 64% from the 1927 level. At this point, the year is around 1931 and the crisis would be around its toughest point, while the French Communist Party would do what it did historically and argue that the only way to halt the depression was to end the capitalist system. If workers would own the factories and farms and share the wealth that this created, they could afford to buy more, which would solve the problem of overproduction. At this point, out of desperation, many French people would start seeing the French Communist Party as the only way to move forwards. In the month of May 1932, France would have another election where the French Communist Party would do something akin to what it did historically as to gain more votes. In the early 1930s, there was a new model of a separate but equal role for women. The French Communist Party set up Union des Schooles Filles de Français to appeal to young working women throughout publications and activities geared to their interests. They were among the first to do so, and I think that this would succeed in boosting their numbers greatly. In this election, the French Communist Party would absolutely dominate, getting close to 40% of the votes, and therefore they can form a coalition with smaller like-minded parties, and their grip on power would be almost secure. After 12 years of struggle, we have made them succeed and for France to become basically communist past this point. So what would happen in France that they are now fully communist? Well, I think that decolonization would be among their top priorities. Let me explain. Historically, the French Communist Party was the main organizers of a counter-exhibition to the 1931 colonial exhibition in Paris, called The Truth About the Colonies. There they mostly showed how France was exploiting the natives and how terrible this colonization system was, so I think that their stance on this issue was very clear. Further, let us look back to Lenin's 21 points to the Communist International, which would be 20 points in this alternate history. Especially I want to focus on point 8, where the communists saw the colonies as being called by the bourgeoisie, and sought to free the colonies. As such, it was mandatory for any party part of the Comintern to decolonize more or less, but also take active steps in achieving it, not just pulling out and creating a power vacuum that would be exploited by other imperialist countries. So how does France decolonize exactly? Well, I think that we could see these colonies to be in a state of limbo in between a free and a vassal France. I think that the Union of Socialist Republics of Africa would be formed, where it would be a transition period between French colonies and pro-French communist countries. The goal would not be to let them free per se, but rather to impose the communist system onto them and then for the French to decolonize, so these countries would remain allied to France and the communist world as a whole. As Communist France would declare itself the liberator of the oppressed people, promising equality and independence to its colonies, many left-wing and nationalist leaders in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and Indochina would be sympathetic or even pro-French, at least at first. Thus we can conclude that France would be very effective to turning their colonies red while they still control them, and only later on would they fully pull out. Yeah, the problem is that obviously not everybody would support this new system of governance, so I think that there would be plenty of rebellions. This is because most French colonial administrators, settlers and officers were conservatives or royalists, and thus they were opposed to communism and the rule of mainland France. I can see exactly these people that own most of the power and wealth in said colonies to rebel and try to declare something akin to Free France, starting a French civil war. The local population of Africa, however, I think would lean towards the new communist regime, as they promised them independence plus seizing the assets of the bourgeoisie, which were the white French conservative settlers. So I think that most locals would be very supportive of communism, but the fact is that at this point in time their opinion mattered little. What I can see eventually happening is that the colonial elite either would revolt or refuses to recognize Paris authority. This can lead to civil wars within the colonies, rather than simple revolts against France, where one side would be supported by the right-wing ideas of continuing the colonization practice and would be made up of white French settlers, while the local Africans with the help of mainland France would try to curtail these revolts. Thus there would be plenty of unrest in the colonies, and this whole process of decolonization would become the bloodiest event since the Russian Civil War a decade prior. For example, France had about 1 million settlers in Algeria alone, many of whom were fiercely anti-communist, so I think that in Algeria there would be the biggest fighting. Interestingly enough, Indochina would become ruled by Ho Chi Minh, and it would ally with France, as remember that Ho Chi Minh was among the founders of the French Communist Party, so I can see the People's Republic of Indochina to support Communist France in crushing these revolts. Further, the mandates in Syria and Lebanon were already very unstable, however France can get to keep them with the promises of more autonomy, creating semi-independent puppet states that drift towards communism. Caribbean and Pacific colonies would also likely remain loyal, as they were very insignificant. Basically, there would only be fighting in North Africa in this transition period, and everywhere else I think that there would be a peaceful transition. Morocco I think would very much side with Communist France, which would promise them freedom plus future territories from Spain. Furthermore, the French Communist Party would have been the one responsible for ending France's involvement in the Rif War in this alternate history, so I bet that there would be great relations between them and Morocco, so the Moroccans can send forces to pacify Algeria. Regarding the rest of the French colonies, I cannot go in detail regarding each one of them individually, so I would heavily oversimplify here. Historically, in 1934, the Tunisian Federation of the Communist Party of France became the Tunisian Communist Party, so I think that this could be done here a lot sooner, thus Tunisia, after a bit of fighting, would side with mainland France. On the 12th of August 1936 in our history, a party organization was formed in Madagascar, the French section of the Communist International of the region of Madagascar, so again Madagascar would side with France. As for which colonies France would lose, I think that Saint Pierre and Miquelon, which is a small island just outside of British Canada and Newfoundland, that could be quickly seized, while similar story would happen to French India. So overall I do expect some small colonies to be lost, but nothing too drastic I would imagine, at least not right now. To keep it simple, I doubt that France would officially lose any of their important colonies that are worth mentioning. Sure, they would be given plenty of autonomy, and for Syria and Lebanon it would be very little in the French sphere of influence, and in practice they would be independent. But what is important is that I doubt that Britain or Italy would want to risk a war with France over colonies while the Great Depression is still ravaging their countries. Further, Italy historically struggled against Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936, so by the year of 1932, I bet that they would realize that they would be in no position to challenge France. Sure, they can risk it to get Tunisia or Djibouti, but considering their internal situation, I doubt that Italy would be willing to escalate something. I believe that France would eventually successfully get to form the Union of Socialist Republics of Africa, where they would impose their political system and get rid of the bourgeoisies and pull out, resulting in these newly formed countries more or less to side with France, but exactly when this happens I think is anyone's guess. Right now the year is 1932 and France has secured control over Africa, but they have not decolonized just yet. Now let me go over to Europe and tell you what immediately would change in 1932 with France going communist. I think that the French would exit the League of Nations. By that time the Soviet Union also hadn't joined, as they did historically in 1934, so I think that France leaving and siding more with the Comintern is very possible. Britain has now lost a very big ally in the name of France, immediately becoming an English rival. The United Kingdom would worry about this decolonization that France is doing, as then communism and ideas of decolonization would for sure spill into their borders, with Egypt and the important Suez Canal being very vulnerable. I think that the most likely outcome is for Britain to form an imperial alliance, where it would include all of their colonies and dominions, but also I think that it would include ultranationalist Italy. Historically, France and Britain did tolerate Italy up until the Italians invaded Ethiopia in 1935, so I think that by this point Britain and Italy will only grow towards a defensive alliance against France. Also, as the year is 1932 when France would officially become communist, by that time the Austrian painter was not ruling Germany, which officially became the case by the next year, so by 1932 it would be in fact France and the Soviet Union that would be perceived as the greatest threat to peace in this alternate history. Another thing to mention is that France would be revolutionary, just like they were in the Napoleonic Wars, so I think that France would not have any real allies on their borders, with only the Soviet Union backing them up. Germany could become ultranationalist slightly sooner, let us say in the beginning of 1933, rather than closer to the end of the same year, and officially in 1934, with the death of Paul von Hindenburg, as it would be a reaction to France going communist, so as such I think the German ultranationalists would enjoy much more support, putting the Austrian painter in charge slightly sooner. Right when Germany would become ultranationalist in early 1933, on the 27th of February, the Reichstag fire would occur like in our history. There, a Dutch communist was blamed for it, and the German Communist Party was banned as a result of this event. In this alternate history, I believe it would be much more controversial, as France would use the banning of the German Communist Party as propaganda pieces, as this time around the German communists led by Ernst Thälmann could flee to France and cause issue in mainland Germany, which the ultranationalists cannot really stop unless they fully invade France, which for them is not a possibility in 1933. In the next year of 1934 would be a very important one, as the far right of France historically initiated the 6th of February riots, and historically following the crisis the Communist Party of France, like the whole of the socialist movement, feared that France was on the verge of a fascist takeover. Now the communists would be in the government, so they can brutally crush this French ultranationalist uprising that historically tried to coup the government, but what happens after that would be a lot more important. By 1934 I think that France, despite being communist, wouldn't have abolished elections, as their grip on power was still not concrete and doing so could risk a civil war that they would be likely to lose. However, with the ultranationalists of France being the ones to take the initiative and be defeated, much like historically, could be the moment where the communists in France would absolutely abolish elections and establish a dictatorship. Basically, in the year of 1933, Germany ceases to be a democracy and France would follow in the next year. Now, I don't think that communist France would overreact to this ultranationalist Germany. Before the start of the Second World War, the German ultranationalists were not seen as negatively as they are today, as they were mostly seen as just another government of Germany. Thus, I don't think that war would escalate over this issue. Internally, France would have started their purges as Maurice Thorez was a Stalinist, so he would impose similar way of thinking. Leon Blum could be seen similarly in France as Trotsky was in the Soviet Union, so many French socialists would be purged for not being left-leaning enough. With the 1934 ultranationalist riots in France and the abolishment of elections, these purges would intensify, and by 1935, I think that France would look very similar to the Soviet Union. For their colonies, some may break away from the Union of Socialist African Republics and declare independence, such as Morocco, Tunis and Madagascar, just to name a few, but these likely remain allied to France. This is due to the imperialist alliance of Britain and Italy, which would have interest in these colonies, and for them only an alliance with France would continue their independence, while on the contrary, if they go fully on their own, they would be colonized once more, just not by France this time around. As such, due to the balance of power, I strongly believe that these colonies would side with France, perhaps even more so than historically. At around this time, French propaganda would run rampant. Earlier I had mentioned several times Lenin's 21 points to join the Comintern, and the word propaganda is among the most used, where even it gives instructions on how the communist propaganda should be given more efficiently. I think that the French people would start to become brainwashed en masse, similarly to the Soviet Union. While the year is 1934, I believe that we could see a very important event take place, which is the July push in 1934, where Germany almost annexed Austria, but Italy prevented this from happening. Considering how France is communist and how Italy, Germany and Britain would have the same enemy, it is not impossible that the Italians would allow this annexation to go through 4 years earlier, but here we can have several options. Either Italy, like historically, would stand against Germany and prevent this from happening, which could be an interesting option. Firstly, it would slow down the eventual alliance between Italy and Germany, and consequently Britain and Germany, but also the Austro-Fascist Party officially took over after this failed coup by Germany. If France were to intervene and threaten with war, they could make Austria a lot more communist. In the 1930 Austrian legislative election, the Social Democratic Workers' Party got 41.14% of the votes. Thus, if France was the one to save Austria, then the country becoming socialist and French aligned is very much possible. The other alternative is that Italy would not protect Austria against Germany in 1934, which for the sake of this video I would actually allow. Let me tell you why. Italy and the British would be in a defensive alliance, which I bet they would want to expand to Germany. This is because the Germans would have been demilitarized for the most part with the Treaty of Versailles, thus they were very vulnerable, and with the Rhineland being demilitarized as well, if France were to invade them, they could pretty easily make them go communist, thus Italy and Britain would be in an even worse position. As a result of that, I strongly believe that Germany would be allowed to unite with Austria, but not in the way that you may think. Historically, the goal of the July push was to turn Austria into a German puppet state, where they wanted to put Anton Rintelen in charge. The initial goal was not annexation of Austria. As such, I think that Germany can get away with annexing Austria as early as 1934, which would be a big deal. This is because Germany was banned from remilitarizing, but they would have a puppet state over Austria, so do you see what I'm hinting at? I believe that Germany could remilitarize in secret much more efficiently than historically, as they would do it mostly in Austria, so there would be a grey line. German war equipment would be said that it's actually Austrian, thus circumnavigating their army restrictions. Further, Germany borders Italy and the British can reach Germany via the North Sea, so the Germans can train outside of their borders and produce war equipment in second-friendly countries. Now you may think that this is a crazy idea, especially with the British allowing Germany to remilitarize in secret, but I think it's very plausible. Remember that not only is France communist and perceived as the biggest threat to peace and the status quo of imperialism, but also that historically the British were heading the strategy of appeasement. The father of Neville Chamberlain historically attempted to make an alliance with Imperial Germany before the start of the Great War, which is very interesting. Thus, I believe that the current British government would be very much pro-German in these different circumstances. Now, I brought up the appeasement strategy as historically you may have wondered why France and the British allowed Germany to remilitarize, and for the British point of view, the citizens were very sympathetic towards Germany, seeing them as being punished way too harshly and the Austrian painter as someone who was undoing this injustice. This way of thinking is absolutely going to continue in this alternate history, and further it would be reinforced. So by 1934 I think that Germany could enter this defensive alliance with Italy and Britain, which I would be calling the Axis for simplicity's sake. By putting France on the map, you can see how the Axis have basically formed a wall designed to contain communist France, and you can imagine that the Benelux countries would also be sympathetic to this alternate Axis due to their great relations with Britain and hatred of communist France. However, they would be still very distrustful of Germany, so they're not willing to join this alliance right away. Now, the year of 1935, we would see several important events take place, which is the Saarland would vote on their future. Either they would join Germany, join France, or the status quo of being subjects to France would be upheld. The League of Nations historically monitored these votes closely, and the Belgian army was present as peacekeepers, where in the end 90.73% of the voters decided to join ultranationalist Germany, 8.86% were in favor of keeping the status quo, and only 0.4% were in favor of joining France. Now I think that communist France could try to influence this vote, however considering the majority option, I don't think they can succeed in doing so, and I believe that the Saarland would rejoin Germany by January 1935. The French got the Saarland in the Treaty of Versailles, where they wanted the region as it produced a lot of coal and steel, which was vital for fighting wars. However, a decade and a half after this, the Saarland's role became less important for France. In the book I showed you earlier about the Great Depression, it mentions how coal-producing regions were also experiencing problems, as demand for coal never regained its pre-war levels, partially due to the availability of new sources of energy such as oil and hydroelectricity. This caused particular problems for coal mining areas in Britain and Belgium. Basically what this means is that coal became less important after the Great War, and now oil was the resource that determined winning wars, so by France losing the Saarland it is genuinely not a big deal but worth mentioning. By 1935 we would also see more French holdings in Africa to declare independence, and most of them to willingly side with France. As I cannot know any of this in detail, which ones would precisely leave and when, I would oversimplify heavily and finish the decolonization process, right here and right now, just so we can move forwards and I don't have to mention it every once in a while. First up, the Socialist Federation of the Maghreb being formed I see as quite likely. They're going to be quite dependent on France, especially for defense, as Italy and Spain would be eyeing them up. France would trade with the Maghreb Federation, which would sell plenty of oil to France, and this would become a big deal. Their economy would be doing similarly as during the colonial days, but there would be no restrictions of it, so it would be free to grow. However, the communist system may be an obstacle to growth, and with these poorer regions we have historically seen how communism did more harm than good. Another problem is that Morocco was a sultanate, which would have to be abolished so they can fit the communist system and ideology. This could cause another civil war in the Maghreb, which I bet that the communists would win this time around. However, the region would become much more destroyed as a result of that. In terms of agriculture, historically there was not enough capital to use industrial machinery and make agriculture more efficient. As such, historically Morocco saw rural exodus that the people went into the cities for work. I would say that the Socialist Federation of the Maghreb would be worse off by 1935 than historically, as it would have seen two smaller scale civil wars, and not enough capital to kickstart the communist system, as basically there was not a lot to nationalize and distribute to the workers. I'm not going to go into such detail regarding the rest of the colonies, but I can see the Federation of Socialist Republics of West Africa to also get formed, which would see very similar fate as the Maghreb, but I think it would be way worse. I think that poverty in this region could skyrocket due to communism failing there. Most of these colonies were not profitable for France, so when the French would pull out, so would the money that was keeping them together. While it would be a single unified state, I see it as starting to fail and become much more worse than historically. This is similar as to how the Union of African States, which happened in 1961, historically failed, and it was a union of the ex-French colonies of Guinea and Mali and the ex-British colony of Ghana, and yes, these were the exact borders. Further in the same region, the Mali Federation was tried by uniting Mali and Senegal, but it only lasted a year, so simply uniting many of these countries is something that happened and had failed plenty times in our history. This state, although a failed one, would be very useful for the communist world, which can use it to destabilize British colonies in the region, namely Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana and Nigeria, all of which were very important for the Atlantic trade and resources going to mainland Britain. Thus, the existence of communist France would simply destabilize these colonies further, making it more difficult and costly for Britain to hold on to them. Now, I think that the rest of French Africa would become among the most successful. I don't claim that they would be very wealthy, as I bet that they would be poorer than the Maghreb Federation, but there would be a real way to make a lasting union there, as it was attempted historically by Bartholomew Buganda in 1957, which could have succeeded had he not died in a plane crash. Obviously, looking at the original borders, Belgian Congo, Portuguese Angola and Spanish Equatorial Guinea wouldn't be included. However, the majority of these states were French colonies. Either Bartholomew Buganda or a similar figure would successfully unite these colonies and form the United Socialist States of Latin Africa, where there would be no bloodshed and would be mostly peaceful. On a side note, it further puts more pressure on British, Portuguese, Spanish and Italian colonies around them, which all are going to see socialist revolts initiated by France and their allies. So, these are all the ones that I think are worth mentioning. By this point perhaps Djibouti is lost to Italy or Britain, in addition to some Caribbean and Pacific islands, while Madagascar could unite with Comoros and other smaller French colonies in the Indian Ocean, but these are not so important to cover. In the same year of 1935, I bet that Italy would still invade Ethiopia like historically. However, here it would be Britain and Germany that would be supporting the Italians. Historically, it may surprise you, but Germany actually sent weapons to Ethiopia as to weaken Italy, due to the Italians historically preventing Germany from taking Austria, while the British were pissed off at this expelling expansion, and Italy was sanctioned and left the League of Nations. All of this would never happen here. Germany could promise to support Italy and Ethiopia due to the Italians giving up on Austria, while Britain would do the same and could give them British Somaliland as compensation, while I just mentioned that French Djibouti could be seized, so I think that we would have these borders in the end, with Italy successfully uniting the Horn of Africa and preventing the spread of communism there. Now, do you think that this would have some consequences in Europe? Well, absolutely. Apart from France and the Soviet Union doing their usual talking points of presenting themselves as anti-imperialist and calling for stopping the unjust exploitation of Africa, I think that many other countries that you wouldn't expect would also join their cause. One such country would be Romania, which was very committed to embargo Italy historically when they invaded Ethiopia, and Yugoslavia was also very scared of Italy, so they can follow suit. These countries wouldn't go communist, however they would back the communists over this issue and could embargo the Axis, which if they are retaliated against with embargoes of their own would only push them closer to the communist sphere. Overall, I think that Europe would be much more tense, polarized and perhaps poorer, but hey, don't worry about this as the next year is 1936 and it would get even worse. I think that the Spanish Civil War could erupt sooner than historically in these different circumstances, as it historically happened with the right-wing phalanges trying to coup the government led by the Popular Front and put themselves in power, which backfired and started the Spanish Civil War. Basically, with France going communist, these events could happen slightly sooner than historically. Speaking of the Spanish Civil War, let me tell you what happened in terms of how France reacted there in our history. There the French and British sought to prevent any foreign aid going to either side. However, only the French abided by this Treaty of Non-Intervention, while famously Germany, Italy and the Soviets sent a lot of equipment to their respective sides. The French radicals that were running the government at the time opposed intervention in the Spanish Civil War, while historically the socialists and communists were in favor. In our history, the French Communist Party was the only major communist party in Western Europe that was still legal, so they played a major role in supporting the Second Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War alongside the Soviet Union. There, Leon Blum's government officially maintained a neutral policy of non-intervention, but in practice his government ensured the safe passage of aid and Soviet weapons to the Spanish Republicans. Further, the French Communist Party also played a major role in such actions as it also sent French volunteers to fight for the Republicans in the international brigades. At the end of the conflict in our history, the French Communist Party organized humanitarian aid for Spanish refugees. So, knowing all of this, I bet that Communist France in this alternate history would support the Republican side much more than historically, and there could be no such treaty of non-intervention, so Spain would become a large proxy war between all sides, that would destroy the nation more than historically, this is for sure. Initially, the Republicans had the advantage in the Spanish Civil War, as they controlled the capital and were seen as the legitimate government, and the nationalists were very disorganized. Emilio Mola historically didn't plan for the Civil War to start, but rather that the coup would be successful. When the Civil War started, he was pessimistic about his side of the nationalists winning, and even considered in our history to flee to France. This is an important piece of information, as now France is much more aggressive and could support the Republicans the most out of any country intervening in the Spanish Civil War, but also France would enjoy the advantage of geographic proximity, which is very important. I believe that the Republicans winning would be a strong possibility, and as I have so much more to cover in this alternate history, I would allow for this to happen right now. Realistically, the nation is still very devastated, but I want to make the video more interesting and boost the communist faction. Later on you would see why. As to keep it simple, the nationalists were very weak in the beginning, while France would send a lot of help and may even fully invade Spain as to restore the Republic, so either way the war would be shorter due to more decisive French involvement. So let us say it ends in September 1937 and Spain would become communist. Portugal would receive many Spanish nationalist leaders and refugees, and the same could be said for British Gibraltar. Now with Spain officially being communist, a lot would change. Italy could try to seize the Balearic Islands, the Spanish nationalists could try to escape to their North African holdings or the Canary Islands, but I want for this conflict to end so I can move on. I would say that Spain manages to decolonize and gives their North African holdings to the Maghreb Federation, plus Spanish Equatorial Guinea to the United Socialist States of Latin Africa, which would appease them greatly as they would have finished their western expansion, and now the Maghreb would put their sights on Libya. Now you may have noticed that I have ignored a major event that happened in 1936, which was the remilitarization of the Rhineland by Germany in March. Now does this happen here as well? Well, I think so, yes. The Austrian painter wanted to do it as to gain support from the people and show how he is reversing the humiliation of Germany, while Italy and Britain would also support Germany in this move. Let me explain. The demilitarization of the Rhineland was an idea that was incepted with the goal of keeping France safe for many further German advances. If France were to become communist, then the logic for this would disappear, and thus Germany could be the ones that would portray this move as a defense against Bolshevik France, which would be supported by other anti-communist countries in Europe. Now, would France allow for this to happen? Well, they could invade Germany as to prevent it from happening, and there they would surely make some very impressive gains, as the Austrian painter had ordered his troops to leave and go behind the Rhine if this was the case. However, Italy and Britain could back Germany, and they could declare war on France, which could see the Soviets to also join, so this remilitarization of the Rhineland could cause the Second World War this time around. Now I'm going to be real with you, this would be a very pivotal moment in this alternate history. I believe that whichever side would win this diplomatic crisis will unironically end up dominating the rest of Europe. So it is here where I want to give you two endings to this scenario, one where the communists would be victorious and another where the Axis would win. Starting off with the first ending, France would cave into Germany and allow the remilitarization of the Rhineland, as the French would be surrounded by enemies, and while the Soviet Union would back them up, they wouldn't border any of these countries, so their help wouldn't be of much use, thus the French would decide to buy time. As a result of that, Germany would be emboldened by this and start to grow much stronger, further violating the Treaty of Versailles in secret. By the time 1938 comes around, the Austrian painter would demand the Sudetenland be given to Germany, creating the Munich Conference of our history. Now, very briefly, let me tell you what happened historically. The French Communist Party also opposed the 1938 Munich Agreement with Germany. There, the party saw 72 deputies, along with only 3 others, opposed the ratification of the Munich Accords, signed by Daladier and Neville Chamberlain. So, all of the members of the French Communist Party opposed it. This was done because the French Communist Party believed that these accords would allow Germany to turn their attention eastwards, towards the Soviet Union. I think that you're starting to understand that France would not back down and refuse for Germany to expand there for free, while the Soviet Union historically wanted to send help to Czechoslovakia, but Romania and Poland didn't allow for this to happen. Speaking of Poland, they were led by a very nationalist government. It also had problems with Czechoslovakia over the exact border, as Czechoslovakia won a border war in 1921 and gained the Zaolzie region. To put it simply, I think that Poland could be very hostile to Czechoslovakia and seek to reclaim these territories, which they could do if they side with Germany. Thus, Poland joining the Axis, although it may sound crazy, is absolutely not unrealistic in my opinion. Remember, the German ultranationalists at the time didn't have the bad reputation today we associate with them, mostly because they hadn't started the World War just yet, and the world didn't know about the genocides that they would commit. Germany and Poland did sign a non-aggression pact in 1934 in our history, which could happen here as well, but the most important thing to mention is that Poland would be more afraid of the Soviet Union, as recently they fought each other in 1922. Poland could ally with Germany as their shared goal would be the destruction of communism, so I think it all makes sense. Thus, in 1938, the French would refuse for Germany to take the Sudetenland and threaten with war if they decide to do so. However, Britain, Italy, Poland and Germany would agree that now would be the time to strike, so Germany would invade Czechoslovakia and the war would expand, starting almost a year sooner than historically. Now I have made several videos on how Czechoslovakia had very good odds at resisting Germany if war were to break out, but now this video is much more complicated due to several more countries being involved, I mean potentially even Hungary as well. Czechoslovakia would be basically surrounded and encircled, with the Soviet Union and France being unable to help them out, thus I see Czechoslovakia to collapse quite soon. The Soviets and France would try to advance on the front lines as to alleviate pressure, but it would not work. France would have to push into heavily fortified German positions, so they are unlikely to make much gains. Remember, this war is different than the Second World War we had historically, where Germany had put 80% of their army to fight Poland and 20% were stationed to guard in France, where the French had seen some success in the Saarland, but decided not to push further. Here in this alternate history, the difference is that Germany will focus on Czechoslovakia, which would fall quite soon, and then would fully shift towards France, while Poland would take care of the Eastern Front for the most part, while Britain would blockade France and attack their colonies, in addition to Italy doing the same. To keep it simple, I think that France just pushing into Germany would become unreasonable to happen, as soon the entire German army, which was remilitarized in secret with the help of Britain and Italy, would successfully be able to hold off against France. Plus, Germany did subjugate Austria in 1934, instead of 1938 in this alternate history, so they would be in a stronger position. For simplicity's sake, Germany no longer has to pretend that Austria is a separate country, so they would annex them right here and right now. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, you may assume that they would do great against Poland, but you're forgetting about the Great Purge, which by 1938 would have just about finished, depending on when the war exactly starts. So you can assume the Soviet Union to surprisingly be pushed back by Poland on their own, but these advances into the Soviets by the Axis would not be sustainable, and eventually the Soviets would grow stronger. Now I think that France would be weaker than historically in terms of their military. Let me explain. I would give you the source down below. Historically, between 1939 and June 1940, about 300,000 colonial conscripts were raised in French North Africa, 197,300 across French West Africa, and 116,000 with the Indo-Chinese Federation. All of these total at about 613,300 soldiers that France was able to raise from their colonies in our history. Now, with France decolonizing in this alternate history, I don't think that they can raise so many soldiers from their colonies. Sure, the Maghreb Federation would be willing to help them out, but I doubt that it would be in mainland Europe, but rather they would push Italy in Libya, and I can see them to quite easily take Tripoli. Basically, I think that the mainland of France would be weaker than historically, while Britain would not be on their side, so I think that the French would become a lot weaker in this alternate history, lacking a mere 600,000 soldiers that they historically raised from their colonies, and this I think would be a big deal. As the war would go on, Germany's entire focus would be on taking out France, rather than doing Operation Veserio-Bung and taking out Denmark and Norway, which was historically done as to protect Swedish steel trade. Now with the British on their side, this would be unnecessary. I think that France could begin to grow a lot more desperate, and they cannot even rely on the Spanish to help them out. This is because as I had this war to start at around 1938, while Spain would finish their civil war at around 1937, they would be in no position to join the conflict, and I don't think that they would be even willing to do so. In Africa, you can see the French former colonies to initially do well and capture some British colonies like Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana and parts of Nigeria, but this would be the extent of what they can achieve, as the British will blockade them and they wouldn't be able to receive foreign support, and considering earlier how I stated that they would be drastically weaker, you can imagine that this war would begin to turn against them. Without dragging it any further, either Belgium and Luxembourg joined the Axis due to the British request, or France would invade them, but basically this would open up the way for Germany to do what they did historically in the Ardennes forest, and would overpower the French. As the communist government would be kind of unpopular and relied on purges to stay in power, quite soon there would be a lot more revolts by French nationalists, who saw the communists as giving up the French colonial empire and losing a war to Germany, so the pressure there would be very high. As such, I can expect that after a bit more pushing on the side of the Axis, that they would manage to get France out of the war, leaving the Soviets to face the Axis alone in the year of 1939. If you remember from our history how the Soviets performed against Finland in 1939, you already know that they would not be ready for this war, and now with the full German might shifting towards defeating them in addition to Poland. Italy may take the time to consolidate the Maghreb and go on a side quest to take out Albania, while the British would be cleaning up the French colonies in Africa. Germany at this point could get to annex Danzig while promising to Poland further expansion east into Belarus and Ukraine, which for the sake of this video we would assume to be the case. Also, I want to mention Japan, which at the time would be fighting China like historically. They can get to cease into China at around 1939, however they would have to fight a lot more to achieve it than historically. The difference is that the West is unlikely to embargo Japan, as the Japanese would be contributing to the eradication of communism. Further, Japan could also ally with the Axis, portraying themselves as defeating communism in China, which would be partially true. While Japan could also fully take Indochina and could also invade the Soviet Union, rather than striking south. To put it simply, the Soviets would be fighting the entire world in 1939, while their purges were not finished, so I don't see them as being victorious, and there would be no other countries that would join their side, as America could make the difference, but they're absolutely going to side with Britain. Without dragging it any further, let me go over to the peace treaty. In Western Europe, I think that you can expect a standard German, Italian, Belgian victory scenario. Italy takes Nice, Savoy, Corsica, Tunisia and much of Algeria. Germany takes Alsace-Lorraine and perhaps a bit more, but who knows. Belgium will take Pas-de-Calais due to the Dutch-speaking minority there. The rest of France would become democratic, and I think that they would most likely side with the United Kingdom, which would abandon the Axis and ally with the Americans more closely. Czechoslovakia would be partitioned between Germany, Hungary and to a smaller extent Poland. Speaking of Poland, they would take Belarus and as much of Ukraine as possible, with them perhaps getting a sea access on the Black Sea, while the Soviet Union could collapse and the Caucasus and Central Asia would be freed, resulting in these borders in the year of about 1941. I can also see for this Russia to become a lot more democratic oriented and side with Britain, France and America against the rest of the Axis, so there would be a democracy ultranationalism Cold War in this alternate history, or hey, maybe the war would go hot, who knows. In Africa, I would assume that Germany would want to retake some of their older colonies, like Cameroon and Togoland, with Belgium perhaps expanding the rest of the Congo and Britain taking the rest, while Japan would get to keep Indochina and thus potentially attack the Soviet Union instead of striking south, which would result in them getting parts of Siberia and total control over the Sea of Japan. This scenario would be very similar to my Victory of Evil series, which I would suggest you check out later on, but now I would roll the clock back a bit to 1936 and cover how the Comintern could be victorious. As I have said earlier, the side that wins the diplomatic crisis regarding the remilitarization of the Rhineland would end up winning this whole conflict. Now in this alternate history, France would press the issue in the second ending, where they would send an army over to confront Germany, which would go behind the Rhine River, failing in their objective and being humiliated. The French communists would be tempted to stay here and form a puppet government, but this likely means that many countries around them would declare war, so France would pull out at the request of the Soviet Union, which was not ready for war. In Spain, the Republican faction would be victorious much like in the previous ending. And now we would reach the year of 1938 and the Munich Conference, where again Germany would be refused to take the Sudetenland and war would break out like the previous scenario, but the difference here is that Germany has not remilitarized the Rhineland, which France would quickly exploit and capture most of it. A noticeable chunk of the German population and industry would be taken right away without a fight. This would greatly ease pressure off from Czechoslovakia, and if Hungary decides not to join, which is absolutely not impossible, as Italy could also be neutral by this point, however I would allow them to be part of this war. With Czechoslovakia being able to put up a fight and their fortifications still being intact, the Axis would find it very difficult to advance. Meanwhile, Poland and Germany would still have issues over the border, so neither would be fully committed to the war. Poland would keep a solid chunk of their army on the border with Germany, just in case, while Germany would do the same, meaning that neither would fully challenge France or the Soviets enough. Further, with Romania historically being against Italy in their war against Ethiopia, the Romanians could provide some support to the Soviets in exchange for their territory being left intact, which could prove to be very useful for the Soviets to reach Carpathian Ruthenia. Yugoslavia in the meantime could also become quite socialist oriented, with a stronger Italian and German presence on their border, so they could flip ideologies and go communist, opening up a new front for Germany and Italy and making their war effort much harder. Britain would still have naval superiority, but if the Soviets and French combine their navies, then they can defeat the British in the North Sea. Meanwhile, Italy would be busy in the Mediterranean, while Poland and Germany didn't have a large enough navy to make a difference. At this point I can see the Spanish to join the side of the Comintern, as their side would be clearly winning. Germany would start losing ground very hard against France, who already had crossed the Rhine River, while the Soviets would start pushing into Poland and Czechoslovakia would be holding out and be supplied via Romania. I don't think I need to drag this any further, but the Italians, Germans and Poles would be defeated under these circumstances, while Britain could sign a white peace and ally with America instead, preserving their colonies and allowing the communists to expand in Europe. Now in this peace treaty, I think that not a lot would change in terms of territory, but rather for the most part it would be ideological. First up, Portugal, if they joined the war against the Comintern and on the side of the British, they could be invaded and annexed into Spain, which would form the Socialist Iberian Federation, with the Portuguese colonies being freed and potentially merged with the French sort of satellites in Africa. Meanwhile, on the topic of Africa, the Maghreb would fully take Libya, while Italian East Africa would be freed and become communist, allying with France and the Soviet Union. In Europe there would be some noticeable changes, but not as much as one might imagine. This is because the communists of Europe were mostly focused on imposing their political system onto other countries, rather than taking territories. Stalin, I can see, to put similar peace treaties upon Poland as he did historically, with the Poles expanding into Germany instead, which is a possibility, while Germany would become communist in their entirety, and could also lose the Saarland to France, but this is more up in the air. Austria would be freed and become communist themselves, and since I'm feeling generous today, I would grant them South Tyrol as well, as the Comintern would want to balance out Italy and Germany, making them slightly weaker and ensuring that on the continent France and the Soviets would be the strongest. As for Italy, I can see Yugoslavia to take Istria, Zara and potentially Albania, but also Trieste, resulting in these new borders. Now Czechoslovakia would be led by a democratic government, but since it would be the communists that saved them and now would basically surround their country, they would put pressure on the people to vote communist, so I think that Czechoslovakia would also eventually become communist, but would retain Carpathian Ruthenia. As for Japan, this time around, they would never dare to take Indochina, nor attack the Soviets. However, they would be in no position to strike south without having Indochina, so for them I think that the most realistic answer is that they would be slowly defeated by China, and the Chinese becoming communist as well is a strong possibility. Thus the communist world would be the strongest in this alternate history. But I think that the previous ending happening is more likely than this one, however it's up for interpretation. Now this world would see most of Africa, Asia and Europe to become communist, and while this is an interesting topic to explore, I can point out that I have already made a 2-hour-long video on a similar topic called Project Red World, which I would recommend you watch next if you want to see what will happen if this timeline was continued. With that, thank you for watching and I wish you the best day possible. Goodbye.